Good
Okay.
morning, everyone. So I can go.
Yes, we are connected.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name's Jill Flessing, and I serve as the chair of the Addiction Counselor Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask that the members of the advisory committee respond to roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Denise Sisman, Christina Boyd,
Here.
Lisa Carter,
Here.
Jason Griever, Chad Jacobs.
Yeah.
You said Mike James is going to log in later.
Yes.
Charity Cosson, Crystal Norman,
Here.
Dulcinea Rakestraw,
Here.
Judy Reeser.
I do see her on the call.
I do too. Zenova Williams.
Here.
I note the following BSRB members are also present today. David Fye, Director. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning the meeting being held remotely.
All right. Well, thank you, Jill. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about any concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested time for public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On May 12th, 2025, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. The recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if I hear someone beep over and introduce themselves, I will let you know.
Okay. This meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda. And the first item on the agenda is the agenda approval. You all should have received the agenda via email a little while ago. May I ask for a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll motion to approve the agenda.
I'll second.
Chad second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Okay, the agenda has been approved. We are going to skip over item 3 as we were not able to get a copy of the March minutes for this meeting. So the March minutes will be included with the June minutes at the September meeting. That brings us to the executive director's report.
All right, thank you, Jill. Normally I provide some updates on BSRB operations, so we'll go ahead and we'll start with that and then move to some updates from the most recent board meeting, which did take place on May 12th. So first, concerning BSRB operations, one of the major undertakings that we have been working on has been the draft survey report. And you'll see a copy of the report for addiction counseling. We'll walk through those findings, or at least the preliminary observations. You will get a more complete report, but we're still kind of working on how to analyze all the data. We have previously surveyed our social workers a few times over the years, but after surveying them most recently in 2024, we thought we would give the option for the other professions to similarly have a survey of licensees to collect information relevant to the work of the BSRB in terms of public protection, but also to further help us understand a changing workforce and some of those dynamics as it relates to things like telehealth and the use of AI and other topics like that. And so each of the advisory committees participated in that process. We had different questions per profession, but the final questions, we strive to have similar questions. So that way, when we finish this process, we'll be able to have a report per profession and some questions split out by level of license, but also to have a comparative report across all the professions. So I think we'll be talking with the social workers, and even though they were not part of this survey, we may do sort of a follow-up for the social workers. That way we would have similar information across all 7 professions, and we could include that profession in the final analysis as well. But that has been a major undertaking, sending out all that information, collecting it, analyzing it. I do want to give a special thanks to a couple of my staff members. Tyla and Emma have done a wonderful job of helping go through a lot of the information and put the information into nice graphics that can be reviewed, and also kind of analyzing responses from hundreds or in some cases thousands of people in response to the survey. So really happy with the results that we got. That is one of the major undertakings that we've been working on. In terms of some other items around the office, we are preparing for the end of the fiscal year. So some of the budget preparation that usually goes unseen behind the scenes here, we're just kind of working on that, tying up a lot of the end of the year type of report, looking at any kind of encumbrances, looking at any kind of purchase orders that are still remaining, trying to make sure we're doing a good job about those items. We are also moving more and more people to CE Broker. That is something that the board started earlier this year as a free tool for licensees. It's an optional tool that individuals can activate an account with CE Broker and then upload documentation of their continuing education hours. And if they are selected for audit, the board would be able to log into the portal and see their documentation. So the audit process should work much more smoothly than it traditionally works, where there's the traditional back and forth of all the material. So we're having more and more people sign up for CE Broker. We're going to have a meeting coming up here with representatives from their company just to kind of see where we're at in terms of the uptake. Since we made it a voluntary process, we want to get some numbers in terms of how many people have activated accounts with their company and how things are going overall. We're always trying to make improvements to those processes if we can. Moving next to some other items, I did want to keep you updated in terms of the work of the board. The board last met on Monday, May 12th, and one of the presentations at that meeting, there was a representative from a company called EBOS, Ethics for Public Protection. And you may recall the board's mission is public protection, and we do a lot of work with licensing, but we also work to receive complaints against professionals and investigate those. This company, EBOS, is essentially a company that provides disciplinary tools for regulatory boards as an alternative to some of the other remedies that might be found. So some of the traditional remedies for licensing boards might be that someone would undergo supervision or have some additional required continuing education hours. What this company would offer licensing boards is an alternative where you would have, let's say if there was an issue that involved this particular topic, they would be able to offer things like, courses someone could go through, or sort of a paper that they could write and be graded and work through some of those topics, or tests specific to some of those types of issues. And so the board received information. If the board wants to pursue something to use those as a tool, the board will probably follow up and have more discussion on that at the next meeting in July. Another item from the board meeting that took place in May, we have reached out to advisory committee members to see who was coming upon the end of a 2-year term and who was seeking to be reappointed to the advisory committee. So I'm happy to report that there were a significant number of reappointments by the chair of the board at the May meeting. For the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, the following members were reappointed to a new term, and that was Lisa Carter, Chad Jacobs, Mike James, Charity Costin, and Zenova Williams. The remaining members are either in the middle of a term, and so they would come up on the end of a term next fiscal year as we approach the end of June in 2026. In terms of other items the board is working on, one of the major lifts for the board currently is over the past few years, each of the advisory committees has been reviewing the unprofessional conduct regulations for their profession and has been looking to see if any language needed to be updated, any items removed, any items added that were missing. And then there was a comparison towards what other committees had recommended. Well, now the phase of that process is the language is with the board. And working with some of my staff members, we were able to create a grid of each of the unprofessional conduct regulations so that you can see similar regulations side by side. And so the board members have the opportunity to look at the language and make a decision. Do you want to standardize this language across the professions, or are there items that you wish to leave separately for one reason or another? So there might be some reason why a profession might have an unprofessional conduct regulation on a specific topic that another profession may not have. For example, maybe something specific to some of the psychological testing that psychologists do, for example. But in general, I think the board is interested in having some greater level of uniformity on the language for a lot of those unprofessional conduct regulations. And so the board is going item by item and making decisions about how the new language will appear. Ultimately, once the board finishes that process, the regulations would go out for public comment for a 60-day period. People would have the opportunity to provide additional feedback, and we'd go in front of a joint committee on administrative rules and regulations for the legislature, and the language would also need to be approved by both the Department of Administration and also the Attorney General's office. So this process should take a little while longer, but I think by the time that we are done with this process, we will have a really nice set of unprofessional conduct regulations that are nice and clear and helpful for everyone to understand. So, with that, I think I will go ahead and wrap up my report. And some of the other items I would normally cover in this report are agenda items on the agenda. So I'll wait till we get to those items, but I'll stop and see if there's any questions on anything that I talked about so far.
Okay, thank you, David. Moving on to old business. Continued discussion on.
I have a question real quick. This is Dulcinea. I'm on my phone, but I'm trying to join on my computer. Can somebody let me in so I can get off my phone? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, and you should be in shortly.
Okay.
Okay. I think Dulcinea is in on her computer.
Mhm.
Okay, old business, continued discussion on regulation of artificial intelligence. David, would you be willing to share with the committee members what you shared with me about, well, could you frame this discussion just a little bit for me?
Sure. So we have talked about technology as it relates to regulatory boards for several years now, but the topic of artificial intelligence has been an emerging topic, at least in the last couple of years. And a lot of states have been approaching this topic, and some have had committees, some have passed laws. In Kansas, we are trying to be part of the discussion to make sure that each of the professions is educated in terms of what artificial intelligence is and what we mean when we talk about it, and how, as a regulatory board, we might be able to add protection for the public by regulating artificial intelligence and what that would mean from a regulatory board perspective. And so we've had conversations, we've collected certain information, we've distributed certain materials for you to review. This is not going to be a short process, but it is a process we want to make sure that we approach it with the right way. And part of this was that we brought it to the board initially. The board said they wanted to defer this to the advisory committees to have an ongoing conversation about, with the ultimate goal of making some recommendations back to the board for possible changes in the regulations or statutes as it related to artificial intelligence. Well, at a federal level, from what I understand, there was an item included in at least the House version of the appropriations bill, if I understand correctly, that would prohibit states from regulating artificial intelligence for a certain period of time. And I don't recall if that was 5 years or if it was 10 years, but essentially if that remains in the bill and if that is as clear as I understand it to be, that might interfere with our ability to regulate artificial intelligence if there's federal preemption. So I think we're going to continue to monitor that. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about it or that we should stop having a conversation about artificial intelligence or regulation of that from a licensing perspective. But I want to make sure that you're aware of that federal conversation, and I will try to continue to monitor that. If I see any news about that, I'll let you know. And if something does get passed that would prohibit states from stepping in, at least for a certain window of time, at least we can continue to study it. And then if they were to open that back up at a certain period of time, we would have something available and we would be knowledgeable on the subject. So I'll go ahead and stop and see if there's any questions on that. But that is the best of my understanding. If there's someone who's researched that more than me, I definitely don't put myself out as an expert on that topic, but I found that to be interesting. I know that there were a number of states that came out opposing that because every state is trying to deal with this topic in a responsible way, and some have already passed laws. And so I think there would be some conflicts of existing laws. But do you have any questions on that topic in terms of the news on the federal level concerning artificial intelligence?
I have a question. This is Anova. Do you know the reasoning behind why they're prohibiting it, for such a long period of time? Is it just to make sure that no one does anything rash, or is it someone lobbying to make sure we don't do anything about regulating AI? I just was curious about that, if you knew anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly. It was one of those topics that just kind of came up in some news stories that I was monitoring, and it really came up more from the perspective of states opposing that language being included. But in terms of why it was included in the first place, unfortunately, I don't have that information yet. So I'll continue to look and see if I can find maybe some statements from people about why they wanted that to be done. I can tell you, I did attend an event a few weeks back. There is the Information Network of Kansas, the Inc., and they partner with some different groups and provide services to state agencies. And they opened up a conversation about artificial intelligence and possible ways to help state agencies. I think that there are some really interesting conversations. There's approaches to how can we be responsible and make sure there's guardrails in place, which of course is an important thing to do. But then there's also conversations about, what can we do from a regulatory body perspective in terms of providing services to licensees or members of the public. For example, there are some states that have implemented things like a chatbot on their website as an alternative to, let's say, a traditional FAQ section or people just calling the board with every question. I'm not sure. I've heard mixed results. I know from myself when I call somewhere and I don't get a chance to talk to a person, sometimes that can be really frustrating. Other times, it does help reduce the amount of staffing you need and people can reprioritize their workloads and things like that. So I am open to those conversations. I always want to learn and see if that would be helpful. So I do know that there are at least some conversations about possible tools that might be available in the future. But as I started to kind of pull strings to see if that was something they're actively working on, it sounds more like it was more of brainstorming how to help agencies for the future. Not that there was a tool that had already been developed that was ready for us to use.
I think David, just what you're saying as far as recognizing the impact that it could potentially have in the field and the ethics involved in that is important. And depending on the time frame, I think what you just mentioned, I think is a great idea that maybe to continue to talk about it and to be looking forward, because I do think even within education and how we're preparing those that may be entering the workforce, we're looking at like I'm on a committee now and we're looking at AI and how we're going to build that in. There's, regulations at the federal level, like with social work education, that it's going to be part of the expectation of possibly part of the competencies that we teach students, because they're already using it. They're going to be using it. How can we, like you just said, safeguard, make sure ethics and guardrails are in place instead of necessarily saying you can't use it? I think we're beyond that. It's how can we use it ethically and responsibly and make sure people are informed to know even what to consider, and things around privacy, bias, all those things that may be inherent in those systems. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we definitely, regardless of, I think if it's 5 years, that's still good conversation. I guess it would be surprising if it ends up being 10, that far out, 10 years. I guess I would anticipate that will probably get changed. But yeah, I think it's something that we need to be talking about, and how we can help guide people. Because again, I think it's being used. How do we make sure it's being used responsibly?
Yeah, and I think, the survey that we put out, the draft report that we have today is probably going to be much shorter than the final report. And I know that's going to be a little intimidating because the draft report, I think, is already 36 or 37 pages for addiction counseling. For some of the other professions, what we have done, which we intend to do on this one too, is to take, we had about half the questions that were open field answers. And we asked people some questions, and people were very generous with their time and gave us a lot of good information. And so what we did with the other reports is we had summary information up front, but then we had references that the open field answers were attached as appendices to the back end of the report. So for anybody who wanted to dig deeper, and we encourage people to do that, to look through all of the specific responses. So the version we'll go through today as a group just has the summary information, but I'll provide another version to you in the future that has much more back-end information. And one of the topics on there is, are you currently using artificial intelligence in your practice? And if so, what are you using? Because I think there is a little bit of confusion concerning what everybody is talking about when they say artificial intelligence. And like I said, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I am intrigued when I hear new things that I have never heard of before, and then it makes me want to research those things and see what those things are doing. So I think as we get into the survey results, that might lead us different places in terms of the conversation on AI as well.
Is it reasonable at this time just to keep this agenda item on the agenda to continue the conversation?
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I think as news comes up, we can just continue to touch upon it. And then maybe by the end of the year, if we have any recommendations as an advisory committee, we can forward those back to the board. And then ultimately, if the board wants to make any kind of changes or recommendations, and we'll also have a better understanding if there might be limitations on our ability to handle regulation with artificial intelligence too.
And, I mean, it just seems like such a broad topic that's evolving and then going backwards potentially at the same time.
Mhm.
Just keeping it on the agenda, it seems like a good idea to me.
And I think there's so many layers to how it's being utilized, anywhere from a superpowered search engine all the way up to replacing a therapist and everything in between. So
Mhm. I already have clients that consult ChatGPT for everything. I'm sure y'all do too. So that's just one item. Okay, are we ready to move on to new business?
I think so.
Okay, so new business, review of draft report of survey licenses. This isn't something that I've had much of an opportunity to look at, so I am going to ask David to give us more information.
Okay, and thank you, Jill. And I apologize for sending this morning. As the report says, it is very much a draft report. I wanted to try to include as much information as was ready to get to you today. I want you to know that there was additional information, and like I said, had a couple of my staff members helping me with analyzing some of this information too. So we will share this as sort of a part one, and know that you will get a more comprehensive report in the future. But I will share my screen, and I thought we would have the opportunity to walk through this draft report together. Based on going through this information with other advisory committees, this process usually takes about, I'd say, 35 to 40 minutes. So we'll take some time to go through each question, and we'll show some of the information and the data we've collected so far, and some of the findings, at least when we have seen trends or patterns in terms of responses. But we'll continue to analyze that information. So I will share my screen, and with my screen shared, I probably won't see if someone raises a hand. So if you do have a question, feel free to just jump in, and then we can pause and we can answer your question or dig into the topic if you want to, if you have some thought about a different subject. So like I said, I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get into the draft report. Okay, so you should be able to see the front page or the cover of the draft report here. This is the report on the survey of addiction counselors. If you go to the BSRB website and you're curious to see the draft reports for the other professions, we have already posted 5 other draft reports for the other professions. So if you wanted to take a look at what the information for professional counseling was provided, or the marriage and family therapist, or the psychologist, you could go to those sections of the advisory committee meetings this spring, and you could take a look at their draft reports as well. Most of those reports were available in April for those advisory committees. So feel free to take a look. Like I said, our goal is to have a final report for each profession, and then also to have a comparative report. So you may see some similar questions, but we'll go ahead and start the walkthrough here. There's a lot of text on this page. This is more of an introductory page explaining why we underwent the survey. And then for people that are not familiar with the Kansas BSRB, it explains that we're a composite board. We regulate 7 different professions, including addiction counseling, and that we have 3 levels of permanent license for addiction counseling. We also talked about the role of the advisory committee, and the advisory committee discussed possible questions for a survey of licensees to collect information relevant to the public protection mission of the board, and also solicit feedback on topics relevant to the work of the advisory committee, and also better understand the behavioral analysis workforce in Kansas, or the addiction counseling workforce in Kansas. And so the survey was opened back on January 13th, 2025. At the time, the total number of addiction counselors in Kansas across all 3 levels of licensing was 1,546. There were 520 LACs, 433 LMACs, and 593 LCACs. The survey, we were originally going to hold it open for about 2 weeks, but we received some feedback and some individuals asking us if we could hold it open longer, and we didn't want to miss out on any responses. And so we decided to hold it open for an additional 2 weeks. So we held it open for about a full month. And during that time period, we sent targeted responses using our survey tool, which was SurveyMonkey. The survey was kept anonymous, and so we could not see which person responded in which way, but we did have a way to know which individuals had not yet completed the survey. And so that's how we could send some targeted reminders to those individuals if they hadn't responded yet. Over the 31 days the survey was open for responses, 422 individuals completed the survey for an overall response rate of about 27.3%, which is pretty good for this type of survey. For the LAC license level, 127 individuals completed the survey for a response rate of 24.4%. LMACs, 107 individuals completed the survey for a response rate of about 24.7%. And then for LTACs, 188 individuals completed the survey for a response rate of about 31.7%. And so we're going to make some additional changes to this report, but right now this is the draft that you have available to review today. So Question one, we were trying to make sure that we had a good sampling across Kansas, and then also collect some information on individuals that may be licensed in Kansas but live out of state. So we asked, in what Kansas counties do you practice the profession of, this should say addiction counseling. So apologies for that error. But basically, the final report will have answers from all three professions, and it will talk about, which counties were identified the most between the professions, the levels of licensing. And for the other professions, what we have seen is a trend that you'd expect. The major population centers tend to be where most people are practicing their profession. And so in question number 2, we asked a similar question, but we said, do you practice in a predominantly urban area, rural area, or frontier area? And we did split this out per level of licensing. So for the LACs, 126 individuals answered the question, and largest number of respondents, 60%, reported providing services in a predominantly urban area. About 1/3 noted they provide services in a rural area, and then the other responses were less than 4% or less. In terms of LMACs, similarly, about 62% of respondents noted they provide services primarily in an urban area, and then the rural response was about 34%. So it lined up really closely to what we see with the LACs. For the LCACs, a little bit less, but still in the same ballpark in terms of the number of individuals providing services. Roughly for each of these categories, it comes out to just a little under 2/3 primarily provide services in an urban area, about 1/3 in a rural area. And then we provided an option for frontier area, but that frontier area is very, very small. And we know that is defined as an area that there is not a very high population per square mile. So these numbers are kind of what I would expect to see, and they are somewhat consistent with the other professions in terms of people practicing in urban areas versus rural areas. Question 3, we asked each level of licensing, do you primarily work in public practice, private practice, an educational setting, or another setting? For the LAC, about 2/3 or 62% reported practicing in public practice. The next highest group was in private practice with 21%. And then third was actually in other. We didn't have an open field response, so we couldn't collect any information as far as what people were identifying outside of public, private, and educational settings. But those are the numbers that we received for the LAC. For LMACs, similarly, the highest group of respondents noted public practice, so it was a little bit smaller than LACs. It was at 56.6%. Private practice at about 29%, and then other fairly consistent with the LACs at about 11%. For LCACs, you actually see a bit of a change there. So for the LCACs, the highest group of respondents noted private practice at 41%, though it was very close to public practice at about 40%, and then other about 12%. So I found that to be kind of interesting. When you get to the LCACs, a much higher group of individuals working in private practice compared to the other two licensing levels. Question 4, we asked each group of licensees, how many years have you practiced the addiction counseling profession? And if applicable, you may include years practicing in other states. I'm aware that, addiction counseling as a licensed profession, there are probably individuals that have been practicing addiction counseling before licensure in Kansas, or maybe started in another state and are now licensed here in Kansas. We want to make sure that we tried to capture the range of time, regardless if it was talking about practicing as a licensed addiction counselor or if it was talking about working in another state. For the LACs, the largest group of respondents, about 70%, noted they had worked in addiction counseling for over 10 years. And then the second highest group of respondents between 5 to 10 years. And then all the other groups of respondents were less than 6%. So what we see here, at least for our LACs, the vast majority, it looks like they're over 90% are individuals who have been working in the addiction field at least 5 years, and the vast majority over 10 years. I think that is notable. For the LMACs, they were asked the same question. The largest group of respondents was over 10 years, but it was a much smaller number. And instead of the 69% for LACs, it was at 46% or so. And then much closer was 5 to 10 years for the LMACs at 35%. And then 10% of respondents were between 2 to 5 years. So that surprised me. I would have thought individuals that were working as LACs would perhaps have been newer to the profession. So it surprised me that there was such a larger percentage of individuals that reported over 10 years compared to the LMACs. In terms of the LCACs, 187 LCACs answered the question. The largest group of respondents, 72.2% reported providing services or working in addiction counseling over 10 years. And then the next highest group was 5 to 10 years at 17.7%. And all the other groups were 8% or lower. Question 5 is another question that we asked each group of respondents. We said, including Kansas, then how many states are you licensed / certified / registered to provide, this should say, addiction counseling services between all states? And that was the question that we asked in the survey. So we apologies for some of the rough draft on this. We used the same template and then modified it for the questions that we asked all of the addiction counselors. But the survey did ask, in how many states are you licensed, certified, or registered to provide addiction counseling services between all states? And so for the LACs, I think somewhat what you'd expect, over 90% reported they are only authorized to provide addiction counseling services in one state, that being Kansas. However, when you look at the list of LMACs, what I found interesting is that there's an even higher number of individuals, 97%, that are only licensed, certified, or authorized to provide addiction counseling services in one state. When you go to the LCACs, 182 people answered that question. The most popular answer was still one state at 86.3%, but there were 11.5% of respondents that are authorized to practice in 2 states, and then a very, very small number of individuals reported being authorized to provide services in more than 2 states, and that was in the 3 to 5 state range. So for some of the other professions, some of the drive for a multi-state compact has been individuals that want to practice in a number of different states, and so they actually have obtained a license and are doing separate continuing education hours, paying separate licensing fees. And so I realize addiction counseling is unique in some ways, and that some states don't have addiction counseling as a licensed profession. The terminology that is used is not consistent across the board, so there are some notable reasons why this would be different. But it did surprise me. I think I expected that there would be a higher number of individuals, at least at the clinical level, that are authorized to practice in more than one state, if nothing else, because of the growth of telehealth or the desire to be able to provide types of services. But I also understand that there are different types of restraints or constraints based on the limitation and scope of practice for addiction counseling compared to other professions. Question 6. Question 6 asks, do you maintain an active license but no longer work as an addiction counselor? If so, please explain why you're not providing services currently. So for this question, for the LAC responses, 89 licensed addiction counselors answered this question, identifying reasons why individuals might maintain an active license but not provide services. And then in the future version, you will get all of the individual responses. But the most frequent survey response, which was 62 of the respondents, they noted that this did not apply to them because they do still provide active services. One respondent, however, is considering changing careers due to a lack of opportunities for LAC licensees. 29 respondents indicated maintaining an active license but not providing services. The most frequent reported reason, 7 responses, being that providing services is not required with their current job. Other reasons why individuals might maintain an active license but not provide services currently is that the pay is higher in other careers, providing services only when needed or short-staffed, and work in private practice with a different license. Additionally, 2 respondents stated that while this currently applies to them, they plan to return to the field soon. 4 respondents also indicated being retired, and they maintain their license in case they decide to start working again. So part of this is relevant to our conversation about workforce and changing dynamics. One thing that we have seen over the last few years, in fact, over the last 10 years, is that while the population growth in Kansas has been relatively stable, just about a 1% growth during that time period, the number of licensees under the BSRB has grown significantly. So back 10 years ago, we oversaw about 12,000 licensees. Today, we oversee over 16,000. But one thing to note is that we do have roughly around 1,000 people who are licensed by the BSRB that hold multiple licenses. And so some of the answers, that are reflected here, and one of the benefit of us being able to do these surveys for different professions is that we know that there are individuals that may be licensed as an addiction counselor, but also a marriage and family therapist, or a social worker, but also an addiction counselor. And so we would like to collect information relevant to each of these professions. And so in some ways, we're asking people to wear a certain hat when they're answering certain questions. And we also understand that it's going to be a little tricky for some people to answer questions because how do they divide their time if they have 2 different types of licenses? And so, but we also understand that there may be people who hold an active license and then for one reason or another may not be providing services or may not be practicing. And so while we have good information in terms of how many licensees under the BSRB we have currently, we'd like to get additional information to make sure that we can speak knowledgeably about health force or workforce and how our number of licensees may relate to the individuals that are able to provide services. Another kind of comment on this topic, I saw an article recently about there being other fields where there is a workforce shortage. And I saw that there was an article about a shortage of attorneys in Kansas, and especially in rural communities. And as an attorney myself, I keep my law license active. I feel like I take a lot of pride in that because law school was very difficult. Passing the bar was very challenging. And so I take a lot of pride in that. And it's a part of my identity as an attorney. But I'm not in front of a judge. I don't do estate planning. And so while the things that I learned and my role as an attorney is helpful in my current position, I'm not officially working as an attorney. So I can relate to looking at this topic and trying to understand, okay, well, we have data on licensees, but how can we dig a little deeper and try to provide good information on workforce and understand, if there are people that are licensed but not working as a traditional addiction counselor, why is that the case? And so I think getting some of this information is helpful to kind of make sure we understand things a little bit better. Going next to the responses from the LMAC concerning if they actively hold a license but don't provide services. 80 licensed master's addiction counselors answered this question, and they provided insight into why individuals might maintain an active license without providing services. The most frequent survey response, which was 59 responses, was that this did not apply to them. Those would be individuals that are still providing services. But of those who did report maintaining an active license but not providing services, the most reported reasons for doing so that were noted in the survey are providing mental health services under a different license, providing services is not a requirement of the current job, providing supervision but not services, and addiction counseling licenses are too limited. So I found those responses to be interesting. Christina, I saw your hand up. You have a question or a comment?
Well, I was thinking about what you just said, David, about how it may be hard for people to identify, especially with multiple licenses. And I think this is going to get more complex too, if we add that other layer of who we're providing service to. So when I was, providing direct service, I had both my social work license and my addiction counselor license. And as I saw people, I don't know that I could really say I was using one or the other with particular individuals, right? They had both. And acknowledgement of the prevalence of co-occurring disorders, I think that's also another level here that we'll have to consider as we go forward, that somebody could be working as a mental health provider as a title, but really are providing services to for individuals that might have a co-occurring disorder in which they're really using skills and the licensure of both, if that's kind of making sense. So I not to make it more convoluted, but I do think that's a legitimate thing as part of this, taking that into account, that I would have a hard time responding. Am I, using, I was working under the auspice of a community mental health center, which was primarily mental health or typically, but I was providing a lot of addiction counseling. So I just bring that up because I think that's another element of this that may make it hard for folks to answer that.
Yeah, I agree. Very, very good comment. Well, and if anybody has any other comments or thoughts as we go through these, feel free to jump right in. The responses we got to this question from the LCACs, 120 individuals answered the question. 67 individuals reported it didn't apply to them because they are still providing services. But of those who reported that the above scenario did apply to them, the most frequently reported reason why, which was 17 individuals, was because providing services is not required at their current job. Some common jobs included those in administration, consultation, management, and jobs in education settings. Other reasons why licensees reported maintaining an active license but not providing services included primarily does mental health work under a different license. That was 12 individuals. Provides supervision, 6 responses. Retired but maintains in case they decide to return to work, 4 responses. They use the license only in disasters or emergency situations, 3 people. Too many issues with insurance billing, too low of pay in the field, or they live in another state. And this does bring up a good point in terms of primarily work in another role. So over the last, I don't even know how to quantify this, but I know that over the last few years, there has been a push for a lot of people to achieve a higher level of degree, and in some cases, a higher level of license. And I think it does open the door and provides opportunities for individuals. But I think some of the opportunities that are provided may be outside of the specific profession of the license. For example, some professions may look for individuals with advanced degrees to come and be part of their administrative staff and oversee certain fields. And so I do know a handful of people just specifically that maintain an active license, and it's something they take pride in, kind of as I do with my license as an attorney. But having that license and that education and that experience, it helps them get to their current position. But they're not in a position right now where they're providing services. So I think as there has been a change in demographics and how long people are staying in school, I think there's also been a shift in terms of who's working in which field. And so I think this is part of the conversation. I don't really have any conclusions exactly, but I've noticed this, and I think it's important that we continue to look and research this topic because I do find it to be kind of interesting. Question 7, we asked the licensed addiction counselors in a typical week how many hours do you provide in-person services to clients? And we actually asked this for all 3 levels of licensing.
Be frozen?
I think so.
Oh,
He is on my end.
Yeah.
Same.
yeah.
I don't know
Well,
if you can hear us, David, but you're frozen.
maybe we can pause for a few minutes.
Yeah, let's pause and see if he notices and tries to get back on. Does that sound all right?
Is that okay with everybody? Oh,
It's okay with me.
okay, he logged out. Oh, it says I am the host now.
He's probably going to try to.
Get back in.
If he can't, I'm sure he'll email.
Yeah. There he is.
Apologies about that.
Now you're Leslie.
We they're doing some computer updates, and they decided to go ahead and just push something through. So unfortunately, but I'll share my screen again here. But I apologize for dropping off there. We were talking about question 7. In a typical week, how many hours do you provide in-person services to clients? And so basically we had 127 LACs who answered that question. There is some subjectivity to that question in that we didn't define in-person services. We just left that for the individual respondents to define for themselves, but we'll show why we use the term in-person services as we go through other questions that have different terminology. But in a typical week for the LACs, the most common response was that 37% are providing between 20 and 40 hours of services. And the second most common answer, as might be expected, was that they're providing between 10 and 20 hours of services. Now, one of the reasons I brought up that we didn't define the term in-person services is because in discussing this question, it was arguable if we should define it for people, but some people I think might consider paperwork to be part of the process because you wouldn't be able to provide those services without doing the paperwork and finishing the responsibilities. On the other hand, is paperwork direct services to individuals. And so some people may have sorted that differently than others, but that's just an example of some of the terminology differences. But the vast majority of individuals who answered this question are providing either between 10 to 20 hours of services or between 20 to 40 hours of services. But there was a fairly high number of individuals, 14%, that are providing less than 5 hours of services per week. In terms of why individuals are providing fewer in-person services than 5 hours per week, I think you can look to some of the other responses in terms of why people might have an active license but not be providing services. And one of the answers to that was some individuals are maintaining the license specifically to be able to provide supervision, even though they're not providing direct services. And so other people, they mentioned they want to keep an active license in case they would decide to go back, or if it's an emergency. So I think you can kind of look at some of that information to see why that number might be so high. But then there were also about 12.6 individuals who reported providing more than 40 hours of direct services per week. And I think, while that's not probably best practices in terms of the work-life balance, it's definitely understandable as people are doing different things or working in different positions. And so, so we are seeing, at least for LACs, that most of the individuals are providing a lot of services here. For LMACs, 106 individuals answered the question. The largest group of respondents, 42.5%, are working, providing direct services, in-person services, 42.5% of the time. And then the second most highest group, about 18.9% of respondents noted providing 10 to 20 hours of services per week. And then about 20% noted less than 5 hours per week. I did find the LCAC answer to be interesting. 20 to 40 hours was still the most common response, but it was lower. It was only at 35%. The second highest total was the less than 5 hours at 23.2%. And so we have talked about some of the reasons that number might be less than 5. You know, I am curious about that, why it is up to 23%. And 10 to 20 hours was at about 20% as well. For question 8, in a typical week, how many hours do you provide telehealth or remote services to clients? So this is part of the reason why we asked about in-person services to clients, because we have heard that there is a growth of telehealth and remote services being provided, but we wanted to kind of get an idea of who is providing a significant amount of remote services. And so for LACs, the highest group of respondents, 62.4%, noted they provide less than 5 hours of remote services per week. And then 12% preferred not to answer, which I found kind of interesting, seemed to be a fairly high total. And then for the other groups, they were all under 10%, but some fairly close to 10% when you look at the groups of 5 to 10 hours, 10 to 20 hours, or 20 to 40 hours. For LMACs, similarly, the most popular group was the less than 5 hours per week at 68%. And then after that, it was between 5 to 10 hours with 11%. And then the other responses were all under 10%. For LCACs, I think kind of right in line with the LACs and the LMACs, the most popular response, 64.1%, that they provide fewer than 5 hours of remote services or telehealth services per week. Though there were 16.8% of individuals who noted providing between 5 and 10 hours of remote services per week, and 8.2% that are providing between 10 to 20 hours per week, and about 5% providing between 20 and 40 hours per week. So there might be some individuals there that are providing close to full-time services remotely. But still, you know, looking at these numbers between the different licensing levels, it appears, at least for the addiction counseling profession, there has not been a shift to, you know, the majority of hours being provided by telehealth, or at least for the majority of people who responded to the survey, it seems that the most services are still being provided in person compared to remote services, at least in the level of, at least concerning addiction counseling services. For question 9, we separated this one out because what we did is we asked the LACs and also the LMACs, are you currently working towards attaining a licensed master's addiction counseling license for the LACs? And then we asked the LMACs, are you currently working towards attaining a licensed clinical addiction counseling license, LCAC? And if you're not working or taking steps to receive such a license, please explain why you made that decision. So we don't have any findings for you today on these two, but we'll bring back information on these. This was one thing that Kansas is a little unique compared to some other states in terms of our levels of permanent licensing. In some states, they may have levels below the clinical or independent level, but you can only stay at those levels for a certain period of time. We do have temporary licenses that are helpful for individuals as they're taking the licensing examination, But for most of our professions, we have tiered licensure. And so we do have levels that people can stay at for their entire career that are not independent or clinical. And we wanted to get a better idea why someone might remain in LAC for their entire career. Or if they're in LMAC, why would they want, or why would they choose to stay in LMAC versus attaining the hours towards reaching the LCAC. So we will bring back responses to you. I anticipate that those will be interesting responses, and we'll bring that back to you at a future meeting. For LCAC, they wouldn't be able to really climb to a higher level license, and so we split out and made a different question for them. And we said, in a typical week, how many hours are you responsible for supervising, managing, and overseeing the work of others? So the idea behind the LCAC is we've just asked that group of licensees, in a given week, how many hours do you provide in-person services? In a given week, how many hours do you provide remote services or telehealth services? And then in a given week, how many hours are you responsible for supervising, managing, or overseeing the work of others? For example, we're not trying to ask them how they're spending every hour of the day, but in terms of the split, what amount of their day is being spent in-person services versus remote services versus more as supervising administration type responsibilities. And so for the LCACs, the most common response was that they are spending fewer than 5 hours per day supervising, managing, or overseeing the work of others. That was about 54%. Though the next most common answer was 5 to 10 hours per day at 12.6%. And then every other answer was under 10%, but there was close to about 10% with over 40 hours. So to be kind of interesting, those numbers were a little bit lower than I would have expected. And maybe it comes down to an interpretation of the question. I know supervision, people could think, does that relate to clinical supervision or employment supervision? And so again, you have different terminology, and there's always the balance of, do you define terms or do you let people define it for themselves? But in terms of how LCACs are providing services throughout their day, I found that to be kind of interesting. Question 10, we get back on track with having responses across the profession. So we asked each group of licensees, do you anticipate retiring from the addiction counseling profession in the next 5 years? So as we looked earlier, we asked people how long they've been providing services. We want to get a better understanding of the changing workforce dynamic and be proactive in looking to the future to see, not to say that anyone has to commit to this today, but based on what they anticipate for the next 5 years, are they anticipating retiring from the addiction counseling profession in the next 5 years? The most common response was no for LC or LACs, but the no was only at about 54.3%. And I can tell you, compared to the other professions, this number is less than what I have seen for a lot of the other professions. The number of individuals who mentioned unsure is about twice what I have seen from a lot of professions at 23.6%. And then the number of yeses, that may be just a little bit higher than what I've seen. And so there's different ways to look at some of these numbers. I know 5 years is a long time, but you could look at it as saying, if you take the yeses and the people who are unsure, if they all do decide to retire from the addiction counseling profession in the next 5 years, that would be a decrease of 44% of the respondents, which it is significant. Now, 5 years is a long time, and 23.6% mentioned that they were unsure. So, but I just found that to be interesting. If you compare this to some of the other reports, the no usually is a little bit closer to about 70% to 80% for some other professions. So I found that to be really interesting. For the LMACs, of the individuals who responded to the survey, the number of people who said no was at 75.7%. So that's more close to what I've seen from the other professions. The number of people who said that they were unsure was about 10.3%. And the number of people who mentioned yes was about 14%. So those numbers are closer to what I am seeing from the other professions, but the numbers for the LACs were notable, I thought. And then for the LCACs, the most common answer was no, but it was kind of between the LACs and the LMACs. For LCACs, the number of individuals who anticipate retiring from the addiction counseling profession in the next 5 years was 62%. The number of people who said yes was about 20%, and the number that said unsure was about 17.8%. So the number of yeses and unshures are a little higher than what I've seen for some other professions. And again, if you do kind of lump the yeses with the unshures together, potentially we could be looking at about 35% or so of individuals in that profession retiring in the next 5 years, if all of those follow that train. So just kind of wanted to highlight that because I found those responses to be particularly interesting. Question 11, currently no multi-state compact exists for the addiction counseling profession. If a multi-state compact was created under a model that would allow individuals to practice in other compact states by changing from a single state license to a multi-state license for an additional cost, would you be interested in obtaining a multi-state license under such a compact? Please explain. The compact description that I mentioned here, that is essentially the social work model, where you would basically have the option to either buy a single state license in your home state, or you can buy a multi-state license. Once that compact is fully operational, that's what it would allow. And so we will bring back the responses from that. We did ask each of the levels of licensing for their responses, and we'll have those for you at a future meeting. In question 12, we asked each group of licensees to assist the work of the board. We highlighted the work of the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, and we mentioned that they work on topics relevant to the board and make recommendations to the board on potential changes to the statutes and regulations for the profession. We also noted the advisory committee meetings are broadcast on the BSRB YouTube channel every other month. And then we said on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar are you with the work of the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee? The most common answer, with about 2/3 of respondents, noted they were not familiar with the advisory committee or the work of the advisory committee. And the next most common answer was that they were somewhat familiar. That is pretty consistent with what we've seen from the other professions. Part of including this question on the survey was to highlight the work of the advisory committee and to help more people become aware of the work that is being done, and also to let them know how easy it is for them to access this information so that they can be part of the conversation or at least be educating themselves about the discussions that are taking place. So if they do want to listen in, they want to watch some of the meetings on YouTube, they're welcome to do that. And so while it did reflect that there's a lot of individuals that are not aware of the advisory committee, we did get some responses back and some other questions that said they appreciated us highlighting this, and they will make it a point to be aware and watch some of the meetings. For LMACs, again, somewhat common, about 69% said they were not familiar, about 18% said they were somewhat familiar, and for the LCACs, about 55% said they were not familiar, about 23% said they were somewhat familiar, and then about 14% said they had an average level of familiarity. Question 13, we asked each level of licensing over the past 2 years, based on your observations and experience practicing in the addiction counseling profession. Could you share information on any practice-related issues you've seen, such as areas where practitioners appeared to need more continuing education and training in certain areas? For the LACs, 109 individuals answered the question. 44 respondents indicated having experienced no practice-related negative issues. So we do want to highlight those individuals who said they hadn't experienced negative issues in that regard. But of the practice-related negative issues that other people identified, the most commonly reported issues, including 21 responses, was the need for more education or training in certain areas. Specifically, the following areas were reported to need more education and training in co-occurring disorders, cultural competence, diversity, working with incarcerated population, medication-assisted treatment, evidence-based practices, treatment plans, and harm reduction. And then while less commonly reported, other practice-related negative issues, including directors not having degrees or licenses, the LAC license is not recognized by private insurance, burnout, the pay for the profession is too low, there's a severe workforce shortage, lack of clinical support, and education requirements for licensure are too restrictive. Additionally, 14 respondents pointed to a number of ethical issues, including inappropriate or unethical relationships, poor boundaries, bias, and treatment centers providing services without proper licensing to do so. In terms of the LMACs who provided a response to this question, 89 individuals answered the question. 19 respondents indicated having experienced no practice-related negative issues. But for those who did report negative issues, a recurring concern related to the belief that loosening addiction counseling licensing requirements for mental health providers to more easily meet requirements has increased the number of incompetent practitioners in the field. Furthermore, there was a call for more education or training in the following areas: medication-assisted treatment, trauma, dual diagnoses, ethics, relation between addiction and mental health, treatment, boundaries, when to refer, and 42 CFR Part 2. It is necessary to note that some respondents, while not citing specific areas needing more education or training, reported a need for more in-person training opportunities. Other practice-related negative issues reported included scope of practice, limitations, crossing ethical boundaries, old school practitioners, stigma, burnout, and the workforce shortage. And then for the LCACs that answered this question, 195 individuals responded. 56 individuals reported having seen no practice-related negative issues. Of the negative issues that were reported, they can be broken down into 5 categories: areas needing more education or training, ethics issues, medication-assisted treatment, ASAM issues, and other issues. Respondents reported a need for more education or training in the following areas: trauma, co-occurring disorders, harm reduction, diagnosis, documentation, treatment, current drug trends, substance abuse, coping skills, aftercare services, dual relationships, sex pornography addiction, CFR 42 Part 2, tobacco confidentiality and HIPAA, mental health, video game addiction, and gambling addiction. Other reported issues related to ethics included: there's been a decline in ethical standards, there's been an increase in ethical violations, practicing outside of one's scope, and boundary issues. And then looking at issues concerning MAT, what some respondents mentioned, the valuable benefits and knowledge associated with MAT, while others believe that it is over-prioritizing. ASAM issues involved there being a lack of knowledge around ASAM and a lack of ASAM certified providers. Other issues reported including a shortage of addiction counselors, increased regulation limits counselors, new licensees are underprepared, insurance issues, lack of affordable CEUs, and a note that pay in the field is too low. Question 14. We asked each of the different levels of licensing, in the past 2 years, have you experienced any issues concerning telehealth, either through professional practice or observations of other practitioners? Please explain. For the LACs, 110 individuals answered the question. The most frequent survey response, 77 individuals, reported having experienced no issues concerning telehealth. And then after providing this response, some individuals even mentioned their belief that telehealth is helpful and essential for rural areas. Of the responses that pointed out telehealth issues, the most frequently reported statement was that telehealth should not be used for addiction or recovery services. These respondents also noted that in-person services should be used instead, and a few went so far as to call telehealth a disservice. Other issues, opinions, and concerns regarding telehealth were reported, including 1, telehealth being ineffective, 2, internet connectivity issues, 3, telehealth should be used in rural areas. Telehealth has increased access to services. It is good to have options for providing services. Telehealth increases the potential for missed observations, and there are restrictions with providing telehealth to clients outside of Kansas. For the LMACs regarding telehealth, 65 individuals reported have experiencing no problems. The following issues were reported by licensees: technical difficulties, 6 individuals said that. They do not like telehealth or prefer in-person services. More difficult to focus, people not being in private, missed observations and body language. Telehealth is not ideal for addictive services and or SUD services or treatment. Difficulty in obtaining signatures and other documentation. Clients, providers being located outside of Kansas, and it being more difficult to build rapport. For the LCACs, 164 individuals answered the question. The most frequent survey response, which was 119 individuals, was that respondents had not experienced any issues with telehealth. And after providing this response, 7 individuals reported supporting telehealth and its positive impact and access to care. Regarding issues identified, the most common concerns focused on confidentiality, insurance, missed body language, audio-only services, increased distractions, and obtaining documentation. It was also reported that face-to-face services are better fit for providing addiction services, and reports of clients or providers failing to be in private settings is making it more difficult to build a rapport with telehealth services when they were also being made. So I found those responses to be interesting. Again, when we provide a more comprehensive report to you, we will have all of the specific answers, and I do feel like reading through those is helpful because you can get an idea in terms of the voice of the people that provided these responses. Though, again, I will compliment my staff members because they did a great job trying to take a lot of different responses and identify trends that they could highlight for you. For question 15, LCAC, we did ask that group of providers, how many individuals do you currently provide supervision to? Out of the 169 individuals to answer the question, the largest group of individuals marked prepare not to answer or prefer not to answer. And the reason for this was a drafting error on the survey itself. We neglected to include a 0 option for how many people are providing supervision to. So the most likely, the most helpful response they could choose was prefer not to answer. But for the other respondents that are providing supervision, the most common answer was 1, and that was about 18.9% of respondents are supervising 1 person. The next most common answer is between 3 to 5 at 13.6%. And then there was right around 10% who are either supervising 2 or 6 to 10, and then about 8.3% of respondents noted supervising more than 10 individuals. And while that does sound like a lot, potentially this could be one of those practitioners that keeps their license active only for supervision purposes. So if that is all that they're doing, potentially that would not be an issue. But I think part of the reason we wanted to ask this question was to find out, we'd heard from other states that there were some people that were providing supervision to many, many different people. And you do have to wonder about, are they able to effectively provide supervision when you reach too high of a number? And so, but it appears that the vast majority of people that are providing supervision are providing supervision to at most 5 people, and then a handful of people are providing services beyond that. Question 15 for the other profession or the other levels of licensing, which would actually be question 16 for the LCACs. Over the past 2 years, have you experienced any negative issues involving supervision? So the LACs, 110 individuals answered the question. The most frequent survey response was that licensees had experienced no negative issues involving supervision. So we always do want to highlight that. Of the individuals who identified negative issues involving supervision, one of the 2 main issues is the lack of real proper supervision. Specifically, licensees reported having direct supervisors who are not addiction counselors, poor support from supervisors, and experiences of supervisors being unprofessional. Staffing issues are the second main issue reported. Specifically, there were issues reported with turnover, the shortage of addiction counselors, and providers being underpaid for the caseloads they're managing. For LMACs, 91 LMACs answered the question. 75 respondents indicated experiencing no negative issues with supervision. The most frequently reported negative issues involving supervision did include unqualified supervisors, being difficult to find supervisors, or supervisors did not seem to have enough time for individual supervision. Furthermore, respondents cite several supervisor-specific issues, including having supervisors who are unprofessional, disrespectful, overworked, unsupportive, unethical, and unwilling to provide solutions. For LCACs, 160 LCACs answered this question. 139 individuals reported having no issues or no negative issues involving supervision. But for the individuals that did highlight negative issues, the most common issue was with supervisees focused around supervisees neglecting self-care and having manipulation issues. Issues regarding supervisors focused on no-shows, last-minute session cancellations, and untrained or unqualified supervisors. Other supervision issues included it being difficult to find time to adequately supervise, supervisors not being licensed in addiction counseling, employees engaging in unprofessional or unethical behaviors or practices, turnover, lying, the belief that the hour requirement for clinical licensure is too low, or supervision is inconsistent and lacking structure. And just to let you know, we have about, I believe, 3 questions left, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for any comments or discussion. So with question 16 for LAC and LMAC, which is also question 15 for the LCAC, do you currently use artificial intelligence or AI in your practice? If you do, in what areas do you use AI? For the LACs, 127 individuals answered the question. The most frequent response, 103 individuals, was that they do not use AI in their practice. After providing this response, some licensees mentioned needing to learn more about AI before using, and others reported looking into AI in the near future. 7 respondents indicated they use AI in their practice. Specifically, areas of AI use included note-taking, treatment planning, or training. For the LMACs, 107 individuals answered the question. The most frequent survey response, 88 individuals, noted they do not use AI in their practice. After providing this response, some respondents mentioned planning to implement it soon, while others believe that AI use is unethical. Some licensees also expressed not wanting to use AI because their clients are not comfortable with the use. The use of AI reported using for notes, coming up with ideas, and documentation purposes. One respondent noted that while their practice has implemented the use of AI, they remain distrustful of it. For the LCACs, 187 individuals answered the question. 34 noted they do not use AI in their practice. After providing this response, 4 individuals reported they are actively working to implement AI use, and 3 reported being interested in AI. Other licensees followed up this answer by stating that best practices need to be established before they would be comfortable with using AI. 2 expressed having no interest in AI use whatsoever. The most reported area of AI use was for note purposes. While less commonly reported, other areas of AI use included treatment plans or reports, grammar or formatting checks, research or information gathering, documentation, generating handouts or educational materials. And additionally, it was stated that insurance companies use AI to review documentation. So any clinician accepting insurance is exposing client data to AI technology. Furthermore, 3 AI platforms were named by licensees who use them. These AI platforms were Elios, Adobe, and Therapy Notes. Question 17 for the LAC and LMAC, and question 18 for the LCAC. Based on your experience as a licensee in Kansas, do you have any recommendations on additional ways the BSRB could protect and serve the consumers of services offered by BSRB licensees? So going right to the heart of the work of the board and the public protection mission of the board, we asked licensees if they have any recommendations on additional ways the BSRB can protect and serve consumers of services offered by BSRB licensees. For LACs, 107 individuals answered the question. 69 individuals reported having no recommendations to provide. And the following list frequently reported recommendations. 1, get more providers in the field to address workforce shortage. 2, loosen educational requirements for LAC licensure. 3, limit the maximum number of clients on practitioner caseloads. 4, limit group therapy sizes. And 5, make number of years practicing a component or pathway to clinical licensure. Additionally, there were recommendations for more training in ethics, evidence-based practices, cultural and diversity, and HIPAA and confidentiality laws, and long-term impacts of prescription drugs. Some licensees also commented on peer mentors, recommending the BSRB look at guidelines and create clear boundaries regarding how they differ from licensed counselors. LMAC responses. 106 licensed master's addiction counselors answered the question. The most frequent survey response, 51 individuals, was that respondents had no additional recommendations to provide. Of the recommendations provided, they can be broken into 4 main categories: BSRB specific, application specific, CEU specific, and other recommendations. For the BSRB specific recommendations, they included hiring more BSRB employees, prioritizing more communication between BSRB and licensees, and recommendations to create a multi-state compact. Application-specific recommendations included requiring more professional references, getting rid of the examination requirement, and making the application process quicker. For CEU-specific recommendations included offering free or affordable CEUs. Additionally, it was recommended that CEUs be required in areas of boundaries, dual relationships, and co-occurring disorders, and professional conduct or development. Other recommendations included addiction counselors needing more funding and resources and loosening licensing restrictions on clinical requirements. For the LCACs, 150 individuals answered the question. 95 respondents indicated having no recommendations to provide. Of the recommendations provided, examination-specific recommendations included making licensing examination easier and providing study materials for it. Other frequently reported recommendations included creating or joining a multi-state compact, advocating for better, consistent insurance reimbursement. Addiction counselors need better pay. The number of addiction counselors needs to increase. Ensure that professional boundaries and standards are maintained. Educate the public about services provided by addiction counselors. Reduce access barriers. Provide more clarity on scope of practice. And furthermore, some respondents made comments about reducing licensure requirements, stating that such a move reduces competency, is a public safety issue, and is not the solution to address the workforce shortage. And then the last question, in case we didn't cover everything with all the questions that we asked the licensees, we said, do you have any other comments or feedback you think would be helpful for the members of the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee of the BSRB to receive when evaluating possible changes to the statutes and regulations for the addiction counseling profession? Please explain. For the LAC responses, 97 addiction counselors answered the question. 69 respondents indicated having no other comments or feedback to provide. Of those who did provide comments or feedback, some individuals expressed disappointment and barely missing being grandfathered in. Additionally, comments were made concerning the student LAC license, specifically that there needs to be quicker approval times and clear guidance on what these licensees can and cannot do. There were also field-specific comments made, particularly the recommendation to explore creating an incentive program for entering the field to help in addressing burnout, the workforce shortage, and current unmanageable caseloads. LMAC responses, there were 76 LMACs who answered the question. 45 respondents indicated having no further comments or feedback. For individuals who did have comments or feedback, one area of focus for respondents was on clinical licensure requirements. Specifically, while respondents recommend reducing clinical license requirements, others say to stop loosening requirements, that is by extension, decreasing the quality of services and causing the people to leave the profession. Other comments in our feedback reported include allow for easier dual licensing, practitioners need more flexibility, stop licensing uneducated or undereducated social workers as addiction counselors. Supervisors should have higher licenses than their supervisees, and address the workforce shortage by creating incentives for entering the field. And then the last category here for the LCACs, 140 individuals answered the question. 93 individuals said they had no further comments or feedback to provide. Of those who did provide feedback and comments, there was reported need for more education and training in the following areas: dual diagnosis, treatment, competency, trauma-based therapies, de-escalation, boundaries, and scope of practice. And the following list frequently reported comments or feedback: there's a need for better trained workforce, addiction counseling licenses are too limited, allow LMACs and LCACs to provide counseling services, create a multi-state compact license, addiction counselors need better pay, it is difficult to find and maintain good counselors, and create incentives for entering the field, and provide clarity on different levels of licensure and what each level is allowed to do. There were also reports made about issues with the Department for Aging and Disability Services, KDAS. Additionally, while some respondents reported supporting the student addiction counseling license and its support in addressing the workforce shortage, others share concern that their view of this license type should not be offered. So that's the end of the draft report. This is the short summary report that is condensing all the different responses. I know we covered a lot of ground, but I thought it'd be helpful to kind of walk through this together. So I apologize about getting this just before the meeting, but I do want you to take a look into some of these things a little bit deeper. And we will have another version of this for you in the near future, which has the appendices for all the open field responses. So you can go back and actually read the specific answers that some people gave to questions. But I'll stop now and I'll stop sharing my screen and maybe just open it up for questions or comments. Do you have any questions or comments about the draft report or the preliminary analysis of the survey responses?
I think something that struck me, which we've been talking about in different circles, is the high percentage of people retiring in the next 10 years. I know for myself, I'm in my late 50s now. All my mentors are leaving, in one way or the other, whether that's through retirement or illness or anything.
So this is Zenova. I had a couple thoughts and questions. So I think it's question number 3, and I was wondering if this is about the where do people practice, like the areas they practice, like urban, frontier, and rural. And I was wondering if that was ever defined on that, because I don't think I've ever even heard the term frontier area before today. Even I know I've heard rural and urban, but also like, does rural and urban, is that like globally defined, or is that like specific to like what Kansas looks like? And so I didn't know if you all had a specific idea of like how you all are defining it, or should it have been defined, or I don't know.
It's a fair question. It was not defined in the survey. It was one of those for people to define by themselves. We thought about including a definition of frontier area because that one is defined by a certain population per square mile that is very spread out. And I think it probably got more discussion in some of their advisory committees. They wanted to include that as an option. But I know there's not that, when you talk about the difference between urban and rural areas, frontier areas have even more sparse population as you get out there. But it's a fair question to ask. We did not define urban or rural. We just kind of left it open for individuals to kind of define for themselves.
Okay. I had another thought about question number 9, which is I really would like to know that the responses for that. This is like people, like, why are they working towards an LMAC or LAC, and why they are pursuing or not pursuing a higher license. That could be really interesting, I think, for me to know, especially as an educator, of like, are there, especially also like hearing these other responses, is like there seems to be this interesting, I guess, conflicting information in some ways of like people wanting more education maybe in some areas, but also feeling like maybe there's too many restrictions and too much educational requirements in some things. But also the fact that it seems like some of these areas seem to be kind of outside of people's practice in some parts. I don't know like what that means, and maybe that's where the rub is, that people are coming up coming up against where their scope of practice is. And like when I think about co-occurring disorders, like it really is like the idea that for addictions counselors at least is like you do need to work with, a mental health professional, but then exactly like how much is their responsibility, and I mean, of course, they can work with co-occurring, but like how much is their responsibility and how much isn't. So I really would like to know like that working towards LMAC, like what are those kind of hesitations or why people are or aren't? Do we have to make some changes to the license or to our educational system? And so that I think that'd be really interesting to know.
Yeah, and we'll definitely bring that back to you. I can tell you from the other professions that had a similar question that have the tiered licensure, I think some of the responses from them were you had a certain segment of individuals that had difficulty passing the higher level licensing examination. And so if they weren't able to pass the test, then they stayed at their current level. Some individuals said they've practiced at this level for many years and they're thinking about retirement. At this stage in their career, they just don't have any interest in either going to take additional school or obtaining the hours to get a clinical level license. Some people said it doesn't make any difference to their job that they currently work at, and they like their current position. And so if their job is happy with whatever they have currently, that's good with them too. And so I think those were the three responses that I recall from the other professions, but we'll definitely bring back that information for you. And so you can kind of read the specific responses from people.
Mm-hmm. The other thought I had was like, would be cool to know about the multi-state compact. That'd be really interesting. And then the other one was number 15, the LAC supervising. Was there a reason why you only asked the LACs? Because, and maybe it's just how you're defining supervision, but like LMACs could technically supervise LACs, right? And LACs could technically supervise unsupervised or unlicensed people. Or are you defining supervision a different way, I guess?
Yeah, we for the other professions, sometimes we were trying to just ask different questions per levels of licensing, and so we tended to just ask it at the highest level. But that is a fair point. We could have asked that with some other groups of licensees, but in this case, we just asked it for the clinical level. So that was probably a question that we probably should have asked for more of the levels of licensing.
Mm-hmm. And my only other thought or comment is, could you all have used AI to analyze this data? Cut down on staffing.
Yes, that is true. In SurveyMonkey, there are certain tools that I'm not familiar with. I've seen that there are some tools that we have not tried yet, and I think one of them was even like you can do an intention analysis to see what people were meaning to say, which I think is interesting. I haven't tried those things yet, but I'm curious about it. So yeah. But good questions and good comments, and we will definitely bring back if there were any questions here that we couldn't bring for you at this meeting. We'll make sure that we have that for you. And like I said, those appendices with all the answers, it can be a little overwhelming because there is so much content, but it is good because one thing that would have been worse, in my opinion, is if we did a survey and nobody responded, or they just skipped all the open field questions. In this case, people were very generous and they took time, and I know everybody's busy, and they really, and you kind of, you make yourself vulnerable when you ask some of these questions in terms of taking feedback that could be positive, it could be negative or other, and especially asking direct questions about, the work of the board, the work of the advisory committee. But I think, the board is really trying to embrace making positive changes. And so I'm really happy to work with the board that is this open to listening to licensees. And I think the licensees rewarded the board with a lot of good content. And so there's a lot of good responses. So when you get that, I do encourage you to read through all the open field responses. Any more thoughts or questions?
I guess just to, Zenova, I really appreciate your comments about the rural urban frontier. When you really look, depending on the definitions, as you said, David, HRSA has definitions of that. Most counties in Kansas, there's only 5 that are deemed by HRSA to be urban. So really people may think they're in Salina or somewhere and think, oh, this is urban by Kansas standards, but truly looking at people per square mile is generally, and there are different ones, as you said, Dave, depending on who you look at. So I think that's a valid point too, even just in as we define practice, right? And what you're doing, what the percentage of time. Again, I think about this idea of multiple licenses, the integrative efforts that we're doing, that somebody could be in a, say, a medical setting, and they may be providing what one person might interpret as addiction type, or substance misuse, substance use disorder type interventions, and may not see that again more as a more integrated effort into medical health, or I mean, I think there's a lot of these questions that could be interpreted differently, I guess. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, that it may be something to think about as we move forward and we do future surveys, to try and be possibly more specific, to add definitions, based on this, what would your answer be, that kind of thing. Because I think, even as I look at some of the answers, we might look at that and say, okay, there's a higher percentage in urban, but if you really look at the counties and where people are located, is that really indicative of the disparity that's of providers in our rural area and frontier areas of Kansas, because there's so many. So anyway, I think there's good information here. Also, interpretation is going to be important as we consider that.
And Lisa, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say those 2 points, and it may have been at the beginning of the draft, and I didn't see it when you were scrolling. Just having those definitions at the beginning of the report, so that similar questions will probably come up from readers, and just have those definitions of rural, frontier, etc. in that report, which you probably may have already planned to do that.
We went back and forth on whether to define things or leave it open to interpretation, and on this one we didn't define them, but I like your feedback and appreciate it, and I think we'll probably define things in future surveys, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and I think it's a really helpful comment, and so good that we're having this discussion.
I think it's interesting the different licensures perspectives of more education or less education, or more restrictions and less restrictions. It's just interesting.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny taking a large group, because if there's 190 people that respond to a question, and then you look at the notable takeaways, and then you see comments that say taking away too many requirements for licensure lessens the quality of care and it's dangerous. And then the next comment is, the requirements are too difficult, you need to remove more requirements. And it's like people can't make up their mind, but really it's people that have different perspectives and people that have different thoughts, and that's kind of why we are pulling everybody to collect all these bits of input.
Yeah, and I think some of the comments, I know that it was mentioned about the mental health and making sure that people are working within their scope. I think it gets gray sometimes, especially with our patients are getting sicker. And I think a lot of counselors need to understand more about mental health to understand where their scope lies. Like what is actually mental health and what is their scope, or how to integrate. Like other states, like I'm licensed in another state too, and they've added a mental health component to the addiction, like an additional credential, so to speak, to add on to that, because they were having workforce shortages and issues with the higher levels of co-occurring. So it's, even if it's not their focus of the license, having knowledge of that to know where your boundaries lie, I think is important.
Okay, we have a little over 10 minutes left in the meeting. David, is there any one of the items listed under new business that you think we could address more quickly, or are more of a priority?
Yeah, so I think I can take care of the next question or the next item pretty quickly. We had a discussion last meeting about making up practicum hours for licenses. and noting that some people may come from a program that has a practicum with fewer hours than what we have in our regulations. I've had some conversations with Leslie to see if this is something that would need to be changed in the statutes or the regulations or how we could address that. I think we're both of the opinion that there are different ways you could address it. For marriage and family therapy, we were able to put something into the statute underneath the temporary license that really clarified that is one of the purposes for a temporary license, so you could use that to make up some of those practicum hours. I think what we're going to propose to the board is that this would be something that would fit under the definition of a provisional license. As it's defined in the statute currently, you can get a provisional license when you are deficient with the quantity or quality of your education or educational experience. And so potentially that could be something that if the board approves, we would be able to offer a provisional license for someone to make up that deficiency by essentially getting more hours. If they came from a program that had a practicum that had too few of hours. So that is what we are currently thinking about proposing to the board. If you have any thoughts on that, please let me know. But I think that would be sort of an easy change that we could propose to the board that wouldn't require a change to statute or regulate them because it would fall under the current authority. Just kind of, it would clarify that would be something that we could move forward on more quickly. And then kind of skipping just option C for right now.
I think we need to have a more robust, meaningful conversation than we have time for right now.
Yeah. Item D. So basically, we talked about this a little bit in the late fall. One of the things that we wanted to do and put on our to-do list after the survey is the board explored whether or not we should have a jurisprudence examination as a requirement for licensure. And in some other states, there is a requirement of a jurisprudence type test to make sure that people are knowledgeable about the state specific laws. And sometimes it's used as a tool for people coming from one state to another to make sure they're knowledgeable about the laws before they come in and practice. We looked at different models. Some states outsource this, some do it themselves. In a lot of situations, there's an additional cost to take the jurisprudence exam. Sometimes it's a no-fail option, but other times you could fail the jurisprudence exam and then have to pay to take it again. We really didn't want to go down that road and make something an additional requirement for licensure or have it be an additional fee. And so as an alternative, what we were going to propose and what we talked about at that time was that we feel like staff of the BSRB can put together something that would essentially function similar to a jurisprudence process, where we could put together questions that you would have on a jurisprudence exam, but we could do that live with individuals through a webinar. So we could have people log in, we could measure their attendance by them participating in that, and then in a sense, it would ensure the public protection mission by having people become more knowledgeable about a lot of the things that people frequently make mistakes on, like renewing their license before they have completed all of their CE hours. Even if you have a week or two left in your license period, at that time you renew, you're signing an attestation that you have finished all your hours. And so occasionally people get tripped up by that, thinking, oh yeah, if I get pulled for audit, I can still make up the hours. And no, it's too late. Or people accidentally miss their license renewal date and things like that. Or we want to put more emphasis on certain unprofessional conduct regulations. So we are at the point now where we think we can design those questions that can be part of the jurisprudence. We're calling it Jurisprudence Live as a working title. But the idea being that if people voluntarily attend this and they participate during the entire hour, they can get a free hour of continuing education. And we're hopeful that if people are motivated by sort of the positive aspects of this, that if we get enough uptake on this, we won't need to make it a requirement. We can just offer this as a service, as a free service from the BSRB, and help with what the board, their goal was, and also make it kind of fun at the same time. So that's our goal. What I need is maybe a couple volunteers from each of the advisory committees that we could meet outside of a meeting just through a Zoom or something and brainstorm some wording of questions. I have a set of different topics that I need to kind of build something around, but it would be helpful to have just members of each of the advisory committees that I could work with outside of the meeting and just kind of start to come up with some questions for this jurisprudence process. So is there anyone on the advisory committee that might have, this would not be a lot of time, maybe half an hour to an hour, maybe once a month, that we could kind of meet up and talk about some of these things. So I'm looking for volunteers if there's a couple members of the advisory committee that might want to help with something like this.
What time frame did you give for doing that, David? How long and when would it start?
I would say probably it would start in about a month, and we could do maybe half an hour to an hour, like once a month. Just set up a little Zoom and then kind of talk through the topics. And if I could get some feedback on some draft questions, that would be helpful for me.
I'm happy to do it unless somebody, if this is your bag and you have a burning desire, go for it. But we just got done doing something similar at my workplace setting. So I'm happy to help, but
Okay. Well, thanks, Lisa. I'll definitely take you up on that. And if there's someone else who wants to help, I figured maybe 2 or 3 people. But if there's somebody else who wants to volunteer, I'm definitely up for another volunteer.
I'm
I'm
happy
happy
to
to.
help.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, go ahead, Crystal. You
Nope,
can
nope,
go.
you're all right.
I
I
think
just-
it'd be great. I was, if nobody else wanted to, I can, but if others are, I definitely have, will yield. And I also have to jump off. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I gotta go.
Thank you, Christina.
Well,
I have more of a question,
sure.
I guess, about this jurisprudence. So is this something that's going to be not required, but like an option just as a CEU in terms of like a person could take it every year for this training, or is something that is it only one time that you do this in terms of like when you first get licensed or something like that?
So the goal is to do it quarterly and to have different questions per quarter. So that's kind of ambitious, I know, but that is so that people are able to do it throughout the year. And then it won't be that if you've done it past and you can't do it again, or that it would be boring because it'd be all the same questions. The goal is to kind of make this a routine thing where we can kind of use it as an opportunity to highlight some emphasis on certain statutes or regulations. When the unprofessional conduct regulations do go through the process of being changed, it'll be a nice way for us to highlight some of those changes as well. So that's the goal. It'll be voluntary, and we've actually had some schools ask us if their students can do it as well. And there's no, I don't see any harm in that either. So I think we're going to have that be opened as well too. So not just for licensees, but probably anybody who wants to do that.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great because I would like be great for our students, but also it's great to be updated into as a person who's practicing license or licensed in Kansas and just want to be updated on license laws and just different things like that, or just even new issues that may come up, or just kind of like where things are going to stay up to date as a person, but also for my students too, like when we teach in our classes to be able to kind of like even this could absolutely be able to be helpful to address some of those things on that survey in terms of like ethics, boundaries, and all these kind of things too that people were talking about needing that information, and bias and dual relationships. So I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, it's neat when they, some of the topics that people brought up on the survey, they would want the BSRB to provide more webinars or CE opportunities. It's like, oh, well, it's in the works. We're working on it. And we do want to, like, it's important that we do hold people accountable and make sure that people are knowledgeable about these things. But I think we live at a really interesting time where people can find a lot of information, and it has been my experience that most people want to do the right thing. There are a handful of bad actors, but I see too many violations where people are just confused, or they just lack information, or they just don't know what the requirements are, or got confused. And so if we can help people be more knowledgeable about that and avoid issues, it's better for them, it's better for my staff, because then they can concentrate on other things, better for everybody. So I'm excited about it.
So David, do you feel like you have volunteers?
Yes. Looks like I saw Lisa, Chad, I saw your hand up. Interested in that. And then,
yes, I'm willing to help.
okay, great. And then Crystal, I saw your hand is up. Do you want me to include you, or?
I can. If you already have enough people, then you guys are good. If you need or want more, then I'm happy to volunteer.
Okay. I'll tell you what, how about the three of you? I'll just go ahead and include you for now. And if I set something up, and then one of you can't make it, then we'll have the other two there. And we'll kind of see how things go. But yeah, I don't want to take up a ton of time. I'm just thinking of maybe like half an hour to an hour, maybe once a month. And I'll bring in some different topics and we can brainstorm some language for questions. So.
Thank you all. And Christina said she'd be willing to be a backup. Real quick, before we adjourn the meeting, I wanted to make sure that we keep item E, future topics, on there, which seems like duh. But I wanted to make sure that you all know that if you have a topic you want the advisory committee to discuss, please don't sit on it. Please email David, tell him, hey, I'd like to discuss this at the next advisory committee meeting, so that is there. So that's what that is. Next meeting in September, David, would you be willing to send out a poll, or did we do that?
I'll go ahead and send out a poll and we can make sure we have a date identified for that.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. And may I get a motion to adjourn the meeting, please?
I'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
I'll second it.
Crystal, second it. All those in favor of adjourning the meeting, say aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. Thank you all for your time today. Have a good summer.
You too.
Ready? Talk soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.